A stray dog sits at a grave every day until the town uncovers a truth that changes everything. What happens next will leave you speechless. The fog clung low over Millstone Cemetery that morning, turning the cracked headstones into ghostly silhouettes under the rising sun. The only movement came from a lone figure, small, fragile, and still as a statue. The stray dog sat faithfully at the foot of Henry Cole's grave, its ribs visible beneath a patchy coat, its amber eyes fixed unwaveringly on the simple stone marker. A cold wind rattled the dying oak trees around the cemetery, scattering brittle leaves across the ground. But the dog didn't flinch. Old Mr. Simmons, the bakery owner, paused by the iron gates on his way to open shop, his breath misting in the morning air. He adjusted his cap and watched the dog with a heavy heart. It had been nearly 3 months since Henry's quiet funeral, and yet, without fail, the animal had been there every single day. Rain, snow, or suffocating heat, it didn't matter. The dog kept his vigil, ignoring the world around him. "Poor thing," Simmons murmured, tightening his coat around him. "Still waiting for him, ain't you?" His voice trembled. Whether from the cold or sadness, he couldn't tell. With a sigh, he shuffled on, feeling older than his years. The townspeople had grown used to the sight. Mothers would hush their children as they passed, and old veterans at the diner would shake their heads, muttering about loyalty and loss. Some kind souls had tried to coax the dog away. Mrs. Hargrove left scraps of roast beef by the grave, and young Billy Tate had once brought a soft blanket, laying it carefully near the stone. Others, more daring, had tried to scoop the animal into their arms to take him home, but the dog always resisted, not with violence, but with a stubborn, mournful strength that no one had the heart to fight. By sundown, without fail, he would return, nestling once again at Henry's grave as the world darkened around him. Sheriff Mason, standing tall and weathered like the mountains surrounding Millstone, first noticed the oddity during his evening patrols. He'd drive past the cemetery, headlights briefly sweeping over the huddled figure. At first, Mason assumed, like everyone else, that the dog had belonged to Henry. But one evening, while leaning against his cruiser and sipping bad coffee from a tin thermos, he spotted something strange: a worn leather collar. Yes, but no tag, and a deep, ragged scratch slashed across the band as if someone had torn something from it. Mason squinted into the gloom, the bitter coffee forgotten. "Ha!" he muttered under his breath. "That's not right." The next morning, he made it his business to check on the dog up close. He approached slowly, boots crunching on frostbitten grass. The dog watched him silently but didn't move. Up close, Mason could see the poor creature's condition more clearly. The thinness, the old scars beneath the fur, the heavy sadness weighing on it like a physical thing. Kneeling, Mason extended a hand, palm up. "Hey there, boy," he said softly, his voice rough but kind. "Ain't gonna hurt you." The dog sniffed once, then turned his head back to the grave. A low whine escaped its throat, a sound so heartbroken that Mason felt it in his bones. "Stubborn little cuss," Mason muttered, pulling back with a grunt. As he rose, his eyes caught the glint of the collar again. The scratch looked deliberate, angry. Someone had ripped the tag off, not by accident but with force. The sheriff straightened, a troubled thought gnawing at the edges of his mind. He brushed it off for now. Millstone wasn't the kind of place for dark mysteries, or so he wanted to believe. By the end of the week, the cemetery groundskeeper, Earl, decided to do some tidying up. The fall winds had stripped the trees bare, and dead leaves blanketed the grounds. Earl moved methodically between the graves, raking, trimming, muttering to himself about back pain and ungrateful deadbeats who never left him a tip. When he reached Henry Cole's grave, Earl paused, resting his hands on the worn handle of his rake. The dog sat there as always, gazing at the stone. Earl had gotten used to working around him, almost thinking of him as part of the landscape now. He bent to clear some leaves gathered at the base of the headstone when his rake struck something hard buried in the soil. Frowning, Earl knelt down, brushing aside the dirt with thick, calloused hands. Something emerged, a small, battered notebook, the edges frayed and the cover nearly disintegrating. It looked like it had been hastily buried or lost, half swallowed by the earth. "What in tarnation?" Earl muttered. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting someone to scold him for disturbing it. But the only witness was the silent dog, who now, strangely, was watching Earl with more intensity than before. Earl turned the notebook over carefully. The cover was cracked, almost falling apart under his fingers. But when he flipped it open, he saw pages, real writing, faded but still readable. His hands trembled, a coldness far sharper than the autumn air creeping up his spine. Something about the dog's unblinking stare made Earl uneasy. He shoved the notebook into his coat pocket and stood, his knees popping in protest. "I'll bring it to Mason," he told himself. "Ain't my business." He started toward the gates, the weight of the notebook pulling at his jacket like an anchor. Behind him, the dog gave a soft bark, sharp, urgent, as if urging him onward. Sheriff Mason was going through paperwork at his cluttered desk when Earl burst into the station, the bell above the door jangling wildly. Mason looked up, eyebrows raised. "Morning, Earl," Mason said, tossing his pen aside. "You look like you seen a ghost." Earl crossed the room in 3 strides, slapping the muddy notebook down on Mason's desk. "Found this by Henry Cole's grave," he said, breathing hard. "Figured you ought to take a look." Mason frowned, wiping dirt from the cover with a napkin. The leather smelled of damp earth and time. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he opened the first page. The words were shaky, hurried, and hard to read, but there they were. "If you find this, know I tried to do right. They wanted the land. They came at night. The boy and the dog. They're the key." Mason's blood ran cold. "The boy and the dog," he whispered, barely realizing he'd spoken aloud. He looked up at Earl, whose face was pale. "You think Henry had family?" Earl asked, voice low. Mason shook his head slowly. "Henry lived alone. No kids. No wife. No family. Far as anyone knew." Silence thickened between them, heavy and unsettling. Mason leaned back in his chair, staring out the dusty window toward the cemetery. The dog was still there, like a sentinel carved from stone. Something was terribly wrong in Millstone. Something nobody had seen or had chosen not to see. And now, thanks to a loyal stray and a battered notebook, the truth was starting to claw its way out of the grave. That night, as a pale, trembling moon rose over the town, Sheriff Mason sat alone at his kitchen table, the notebook open before him. The words echoed in his mind, filling the silent house with 1,000 unspoken fears. The boy and the dog. He poured himself a glass of water, but his hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, carrying with it the sense that the past was not as buried as everyone had believed. Somewhere out there, hidden in shadows, lay the rest of Henry's story, and if Mason was going to uncover it, he would have to follow the trail left behind by a grieving dog and a carpenter's dying words. And whatever lay at the end of that trail, Mason already knew it wouldn't be easy to face. Sheriff Mason sat hunched over his old wooden desk, the battered notebook trembling slightly in his rough hands. The office smelled of stale coffee and damp paper, the only light coming from a single desk lamp that cast long, wavering shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, and the lonely howl of a dog echoed in the night, a chilling reminder of the mystery that had begun to unravel. The notebook's cover was cracked and peeling, but the pages inside, though stained by dirt and time, still held Henry Cole's handwriting, crooked, deliberate strokes as if every word carried a weight he had struggled to lift. Mason turned the pages slowly, the old leather creaking, his jaw tightening with every new line he read. "They came again last night, asking, demanding. I won't sell it. I can't. Not after what I found. The boy and the dog. They're the key now. If anything happens to me, they must protect it. I trust them more than I trust any man." Mason leaned back, running a hand through his graying hair. His mind whirred like an engine stuck in mud. What land? What boy? Henry had no children anyone knew of, and as for the dog, It had just seemed like a lonely stray mourning its master. But this hinted at something deeper, something far more dangerous. He rose from his chair, the old floorboards groaning under his weight, and crossed the room to the filing cabinet. Yanking it open with a grunt, he rifled through Old Town records, his fingers moving faster as a sick feeling began to creep into his chest. Henry Cole had bought a property just outside Millstone's border years ago, but the purchase had been kept unusually quiet, no deed on public record, no mention in the town's usual archives. Hidden in plain sight, Mason thought grimly. A loud knock startled him, and Deputy Harris poked his head into the office. "You all right, Sheriff? You look like you seen a ghost." Mason snapped the notebook shut. "Get me everything you can find on missing persons from Ashwood County. Start with about 12 years ago." Deputy Harris frowned, but nodded. "Yes, sir." As Harris left, Mason's gaze returned to the final page Henry had written. A small, nearly invisible note had been scrawled in the bottom margin. "Trust the gravekeeper." The sheriff's stomach twisted. It was a riddle layered atop another riddle, and the only living clue he had was the dog sitting at that grave day after day. The next morning dawned heavy and gray, the clouds hanging low like a lid over Millstone. Mason drove his dusty Ford pickup to the cemetery, where the groundskeeper, a wiry old man named Walt, was raking leaves near Henry's grave. The dog sat there as always, still as a statue, his dark eyes tracking Mason's every step. Mason approached slowly, his boots crunching on the frostbitten grass. "Walt," he said, voice low, "you found anything else near the grave lately?" Walt scratched his chin with a gloved hand. "Nothing but that notebook, Sheriff. Dog's been digging though. Always at the same spot, just behind the stone." Mason knelt by the grave, studying the disturbed dirt. He looked at the dog, who gave a soft whine, almost as if urging him forward. Something inside Mason told him not to dismiss it. "We're setting up cameras tonight," Mason said, standing. "I want to see exactly what this dog's after." Walt hesitated, his rake dragging in the dirt. "Sheriff, you think this has to do with that land Henry wouldn't talk about?" Mason gave a hard nod. "I think it's bigger than we ever guessed." That night, under the dim glow of the moon, Mason and his deputies installed 3 motion sensor cameras around Henry's grave. They left food and water for the dog but otherwise stayed back, letting the cemetery fall into its natural silence. Hours passed. The town slept. The wind whispered through the old oak trees that lined the cemetery fence, and somewhere in the distance, a train horn moaned. Just past midnight, the cameras stirred to life. The dog, until then lying still, suddenly rose and padded toward the headstone. With practiced movements, he began to dig, his paws scratching fiercely at the earth. Mason, watching the footage live from his laptop in the patrol car, leaned forward, heart hammering. The dog dug deeper, deeper until something caught the moonlight. Mason squinted. It was metal, a small, rusted object wrapped in a piece of faded cloth. The dog pulled it from the ground with his teeth, then sat beside it, guarding it like a treasure. Mason grabbed his coat and ran. The grave smelled of wet earth and cold stone. Mason dropped to his knees beside the dog, who stared at him with those deep, knowing eyes. Gently, Mason lifted the bundle from the dirt, his hands trembling. Unwrapping it revealed an old, iron key, its surface mottled with rust, but the craftsmanship unmistakable. This had been made with care, for something important. The sheriff rose, clutching the key, his mind spinning. "What were you hiding, Henry?" he muttered into the night. The dog barked once, sharp, commanding, startling Mason. It was as if the animal understood the urgency, the need to act before someone else could discover the secret. Mason turned to Walt, who had crept up behind him, flashlight trembling in his hand. "Get this area sealed off. No one comes near it without my say-so."
Yes, Sheriff. Walt está mered.
Mason drove back to the station with the key tucked safely inside a cloth pouch, his thoughts racing faster than the truck's engine. Henry's notes, the missing boy, the land, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed now begged to be solved. He barely noticed the headlights that flickered behind him for a moment before vanishing into the night. Back in the station, Mason spread out maps of the town and the surrounding woods, tracing possible locations. Henry's property had been listed under a false name, buried under layers of fake paperwork. Someone had clearly wanted it forgotten. Mason stared at the satellite image of the forest. A storage shed, hidden away from any road or path, marked only by a faint clearing barely visible from above. He tightened his grip on the key. A knock at the door jolted him. Deputy Harris stepped in, holding a thin folder. "Found something," Harris said, dropping it onto the desk. 12 years ago, kid named Eli Barnes disappeared from Ashwood County. About 10 years old at the time. Big search, no leads. Vanished without a trace. Mason flipped through the file, his stomach sinking. Eli had bright blue eyes, shaggy brown hair, and in the only photo he was hugging a scrappy black and white dog. Mason's hand froze on the photo. The same dog now sitting in the cemetery. He looked up at Harris, his face pale. "Get me everything you can on the Barnes family. And start looking into Henry Cole's time before he came to Millstone." "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Harris asked, voice barely above a whisper. Mason nodded grimly. Henry didn't find that dog. And he didn't just stumble into Millstone. He was running, hiding. Outside, the storm clouds thickened, and the wind rose to a howl, rattling the windows of the old sheriff's office. In the darkness, the town of Millstone slept uneasily, unaware that its long-held beliefs were beginning to rot from the inside out. And somewhere out there, watching the sheriff's every move, someone else knew the secret was on the verge of being exposed. They wouldn't let it happen without a fight. Sheriff Mason stood under the heavy gray sky, the rusted key weighing heavily in his hand. It was early morning, and the mist curled around the cemetery like long, ghostly fingers. Mason's boots crunched over the gravel path as he stared once more at Henry Cole's grave, the faithful dog sitting silently beside it, as if sensing the burden now laid on Mason's shoulders. Mason clenched the key tighter, feeling the cold bite of the metal against his palm. "Henry trusted you," he thought grimly. "Now it's up to you to finish what he started." Later that afternoon, inside the dimly lit sheriff's office, Mason spread out old town maps and property records on his desk. Files, some yellowed with age, were stacked around him like crumbling towers. The air smelled of stale coffee and dust. His office was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional shuffle of papers as he worked. Hours passed. Frustration gnawed at Mason as he pored over deed after deed, looking for any sign of a property tied to Henry Cole. Just as the last sliver of daylight slipped from the sky, Mason spotted it. A forgotten plot of land recorded decades ago, its location tucked deep into the woods on the outskirts of Millstone. No address, no ownership transfers. Only a name scratched into the margin in faded ink. H. Cole. Mason grabbed his hat and jacket, a sharp determination burning through the weariness. Before leaving, he glanced at the dog, who had made a bed beside his desk, resting but alert. "You coming?" Mason muttered. The dog's ears perked up. Without a sound, he rose and padded to Mason's side. The woods were thick and dark, branches clawing at Mason's jacket as he pushed through the undergrowth. The dog led the way, nose low to the ground, tail stiff with focus. The flashlight Mason carried cut a narrow path through the shadows, but the darkness seemed to press in tighter with every step. Finally, they stumbled into a clearing. There, almost swallowed by ivy and thyme, stood a small wooden shed, its roof sagging and walls scarred by weather. Mason approached cautiously, his heart hammering against his ribs. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the rusted key and slid it into the old padlock. Clicked. The door groaned open, releasing a musty breath of trapped air. Mason swept the beam of his flashlight inside and froze. Piles of dusty boxes lined the walls, each labeled with names, dates, and places. Yellowed envelopes stuffed with photographs and official documents peeked from the tops. Mason stepped carefully inside, the floorboards creaking under his weight. In the center of the shed was a battered steel trunk. A single tag dangled from its latch. For the right hands, With a deep breath, Mason flipped it open. Inside were files, evidence of illegal land deals, bribery ledgers, and worst of all, missing persons reports that had mysteriously vanished from police archives. Every document pointed back to the same names again and again. Mayor Dalton, Councilman Briggs, and Councilman Harmon. Men who had long ruled Millstone with an iron grip cloaked in false smiles. Mason's jaw tightened. His fingers brushed over a bundle of letters at the bottom of the trunk. Henry's handwriting scrawled across them, desperate and worn. If you're reading this, I didn't make it. The town needs the truth. Protect them. Behind Mason, the dog let out a low, rumbling growl. Mason spun around, flashlight beams slicing through the dark, and caught the gleam of a pair of eyes just beyond the tree line. Someone was watching. Without hesitation, Mason slammed the trunk shut, tucked a handful of the most damning documents into his jacket, and snapped the lock back into place. He backed away, keeping the shed between himself and the shadow lurking beyond. The walk back to his truck felt longer, every crack of a branch underfoot making Mason's pulse spike. But no one followed. Not yet. At the station, Mason wasted no time. He called in a trusted federal agent he knew from years back, someone who owed him a favor and, more importantly, wasn't tied to Millstone's corruption. Within 24 hours, the small town woke to the sight of unmarked cars rolling down Main Street. Mason stood at the courthouse steps, documents in hand, watching as agents moved quickly and quietly. He caught a glimpse of Mayor Dalton, being led out of his office in handcuffs, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. "This is a mistake," Dalton bellowed, struggling against the agents. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Mason stepped forward, his face like stone. "No, Dalton," he said evenly, voice carrying over the crowd gathering in stunned silence. "It's you who forgot." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, Dalton's filled with venom, Mason's with grim satisfaction. Then Dalton was shoved into a black car, the door slamming shut behind him. In the following days, Millstone was a whirlwind of revelations. Stories poured out of families cheated out of land, of young men and women who had disappeared after crossing powerful figures, of money passing through shadowy hands. The betrayal ran deep, and the pain of it rocked the town to its foundation. But amidst the wreckage, there was healing too. The plot of land Henry had died protecting, it turned out, was sacred in more ways than one. Beneath its rolling hills were unmarked graves, the resting place of some of the missing, buried in secret to hide the town's sins. In a powerful gesture, the townspeople came together to transform the land into a memorial park, a place to honor the lost and remember the courage it had taken to bring the truth to light. Sheriff Mason made sure Henry Cole's name stood at the entrance of the park, carved into the stone archway alongside a simple inscription: "For the unseen, the unheard, and the brave." As for the dog, Mason had already made up his mind. He took the old stray home, naming him Cole in honor of the man and mission he had served so loyally. It wasn't long before Cole became a fixture in Millstone, trotting faithfully beside Mason on patrol, lying behind the counter at the diner, or sitting proudly during town ceremonies. Each year, on the anniversary of Henry's death, the town gathered at the cemetery, not to mourn, but to celebrate. They laid flowers at Henry's grave, telling stories of how he had saved them without them ever knowing. On one such evening, as the sun dipped low and golden light bathed the cemetery, Mason knelt by the grave with Cole sitting solemnly beside him. "You did good, old man," Mason murmured, brushing the dirt from Henry's stone. "You both did." The dog gave a soft, contented woof, pressing against Mason's side. For the first time in a long while, Sheriff Mason felt the heavy weight of duty lift just a little. In a town once ruled by silence and fear, loyalty and quiet bravery had finally spoken louder. And thanks to a humble carpenter, a watchful stray, and the stubborn sheriff who listened, Millstone had a second chance. And they weren't about to waste it. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, created to highlight the profound bond between humans and animals, and the enduring power of loyalty and love. Its purpose is to raise awareness, promote empathy, and encourage meaningful discussions about compassion, connection, and the unseen stories that surround us.